What if the moment everyone assumed was stable was only stable because no one had tested it properly? And what if the first real test didn't just challenge the system, but forced it to evolve into something no doctrine had ever prepared for? Because after the straight episodes, something deeper started to emerge. Not another escalation, not another blockade, but a structural shift in how maritime power itself behaves. And this time, the question was no longer about Iran. It was about whether any state can still use geography as leverage in a system that reacts faster than decisions can be made. Before we go further, hit the like button, subscribe if you're following this series, and share this with someone who still thinks maritime choke points work the way they used to. Because what comes next is where everything gets uncomfortable. Let's get into it. For decades, the global system treated choke points like pressure valves. The Strait of Hormuz, the Malacca Passage, the Bab el-Mandeb, they were seen as predictable stress points. You could model them, you could price them, you could detour around them, but you didn't redesign the system itself. That assumption held, because every disruption still followed a familiar pattern. Signal, response, delay, negotiation, then stabilization. But the latest cycle did something different. It removed the space between signal and response, not by making responses faster, but by making the system interpret the signal as the start of the response itself. And that changes everything, because in traditional maritime doctrine, the gap is where leverage exists. That gap is where shipping adjusts routes, where insurance premiums spike, where markets panic before navies arrive. But once that gap collapses, the economic phase shift disappears, and all that remains is immediate adaptation. No delay window, no pricing shock curve, just instant recalibration. And that's where the real shift began. After the initial Strait crisis cycle, naval planners didn't talk about victory conditions anymore. They started talking about system behavior, because something unusual was happening. Every attempted disruption was no longer producing a prolonged global shock. It was producing a short, sharp distortion, followed by rapid normalization, almost as if the global shipping network was learning faster than the actors trying to disrupt it. Insurance firms began adjusting premiums in hours, not days. Shipping firms rerouted dynamically, using automated quarter modeling. Energy traders stopped reacting to headlines and started reacting to confirmed movement data only. The system didn't freeze anymore. It flexed, and that is fundamentally different, because flexibility removes leverage by absorbing pressure instead of amplifying it. Meanwhile, military posture in the region evolved in parallel, not necessarily in scale, but in architecture, because traditional deterrence assumes reaction time matters. You threaten, the other side calculates, then responds. But once sensors, satellites, and maritime tracking networks compress that timeline to near minus real minus time interpretation, deterrence stops being psychological and becomes structural. There's no longer a moment where intent isn't clear, and that eliminates the strategic pause that most coercion strategies depend on, which means something important happened, without being formally announced anywhere. The entire idea of testing the system became less effective, because every test was immediately absorbed into the system's learning cycle. Each probe updated the response map. Each movement refined classification models. Each ambiguity became training data. So instead of discovering weak points, actors were increasingly reinforcing the system they were probing. And that created a feedback loop, not of escalation, but of adaptation asymmetry. One side experiments, the other side learns. Faster. Now zoom out for a second, because this isn't just about one region. Energy markets reacted in a way that surprised even analysts. Not because prices stayed high, but because volatility windows shortened. Historically, energy shocks create long tails, panic spikes, followed by slow correction. But in this cycle, the spikes became narrower, more contained, almost compressed. Markets weren't calm, they were just faster, which creates a different kind of risk entirely. Because when volatility compresses, it doesn't disappear. It stores pressure elsewhere in the system. In financing structures, in freight contracts, in sovereign reserve planning, quiet stress replaces visible panic. And quiet stress is harder to detect, but more persistent. This is where geopolitics starts to merge with infrastructure logic. Because modern maritime control is no longer just about blocking or allowing passage. It's about controlling predictability itself. And predictability is what global trade depends on. Without it, insurance pricing breaks. Long-term contracts weaken. Investment planning shortens. And the entire economic system becomes more reactive and less strategic. That's the real shift. Not closure or openness, but time horizon collapse. Meanwhile, regional actors adapted in their own way, not by confronting the system directly, but by attempting to operate inside its reaction window, testing whether short bursts of disruption could still outpace automated stabilization cycles. But the results were consistent. Short-term disruption, rapid normalization, limited strategic gain, which raises a deeper question. If disruption no longer produces lasting leverage, what replaces it? And that question is still unresolved, because no doctrine fully accounts for a world where reaction time is approaching zero, or where classification systems replace human decision cycles in real time, or where maritime risk is priced continuously, rather than episodically. This is where military analysts become cautious, because once a system reaches this level of responsiveness, traditional escalation ladders stop functioning cleanly. There is no longer step 1, step 2, step 3. There is only detection, classification, response, compressed into a single loop. And that loop doesn't pause for signaling behavior. It only processes it, which creates a paradox. The more an actor tries to signal strength, the more data the system collects about how to neutralize that signal. So the signal weakens over time, even if the intent remains unchanged. And that's the part most people miss. This is not about who controls the strait in a symbolic sense. It's about who controls the interpretation layer between movement and meaning. Because whoever controls interpretation controls response timing, and whoever controls response timing controls economic impact. So where does this go next? Analysts are divided. Some believe this leads to stabilization through saturation, meaning the system becomes so responsive that large scale disruptions become economically irrational. Others believe it leads to fragmentation, where actors shift away from choke points entirely, toward decentralized routing networks that reduce strategic dependency. And a third group sees something more unstable, a world where every trope becomes a live test of global response architecture. Not war, not peace, but continuous calibration under pressure, which is harder to predict than either. And that brings us back to the core question. What happens when a threat doesn't disappear, but becomes unusable? Not because it is removed, but because its effect no longer scales. That is where we are now. A choke point that still exists physically, but behaves differently operationally. A system that still has tension points, but responds before pressure accumulates. And a strategic environment, where history doesn't repeat. It updates, and the update cycle is getting faster. So the real question isn't what happened in the strait, or who controlled it. The real question is this. If leverage only works when systems are slow enough to feel it, what happens when nothing is slow anymore? Because the next phase won't be defined by closure or access. It will be defined by who adapts fastest, inside a system that never stops learning. And the uncomfortable truth is, everyone is still adjusting to that reality in real time, some faster than others. And the gap between those speeds is where the next global shift will quietly form. If you want the next part of this series, stay tuned, because what comes next isn't about the sea anymore. It's about the systems watching it.